This is Mishnah in Depth Shevuot with Ms. Shalhevet Schwartz. Thank you and welcome back everyone to the second class. Mishnah in Depth is part of the Rifka Rosenwein Mishnah Division and sponsored in her memory by her family. This class is a supplement to the standard daily Mishnah Yomit study schedule, where we are assuming that you're learning 1 to 2 mishnayot a day on your own and coming together at the end of each week to look into some things more in depth. And with that, I'm happy to hand things over to Shalhevet Schwartz. All I ask is, if you are asking a question, great. If you are not speaking, to please keep yourself muted so we don't pick up on background noise. And you are always welcome to ask things in chat. All right.
All right. Hi everyone. It's great to see you guys again. And yeah, good to be back. The two prakim that were on the roster for this week are two, I would say, very these are the two non-standard prakim for Masechet Shevuot. These are the two prakim that deal not with Shevuot but with korbanot and kapara, the prakim that are really about what the first Mishnah calls Yediot HaTumah. And because of that, yeah, the rhythm of them and I think the themes that are really exploring these prakim are a little bit different from what we'll see in the rest of the Masechet, but I think it's a cool opportunity to explore an area of halacha and an area of rabbinic thought, really, that we don't necessarily think about that much nowadays, that we don't have a Beit HaMikdash around, and hopefully it'll be an opportunity to think a little bit about how the Torah and how the rabbis thought about sin and exculpation of sin, and how that whole process worked and looked, and what responsibility and atonement mean and look like in biblical and rabbinic literature. So with that, here I'm just gonna, okay, there we go. So with that, just a quick introduction to what we're gonna do, like how today is gonna work. We are going to start with a brief kind of run through review of really the content of these two prakim of mishnayot, so that especially if people, for those who weren't necessarily following along throughout the week, you'll be able to get a sense of the mishnayot that we covered. And then with that, we're going to use as a jumping off point the last mishnah of the second parak, which we're going to read closely and look at a kind of interesting oddity that we're going to see in that Mishnah. We're going to see how that oddity plays out actually throughout this Mishnah's parallels throughout Tanaitic literature, meaning its parallels in the Midrashei Halacha and the Tosefta, and how that oddity gets explored later on in the Gemara, in the Bavli, and that little close reading exercise with that little Mishnah, I think, is going to bring us it's going to offer us a window into some of the larger questions that we're then going to have an opportunity to explore about Yediot HaTumah, about Kapara, and about how this whole picture looks and works together. So, sound good with that? Okay, we're going to take off on our little review of the content of the Mishnah that we saw. So, Parak Aleph. Parak Aleph is the parak that is called Shevuot Shtaim, which starts out with that Mishnah that we looked at last week about the different Shtaim Shehina Arbas, and then goes to discuss the different kinds of the different kinds of knowledge or not knowledge I can have of different sins, and what form of sacrifice covers which form of sin. So if you look at the top left box over there, the Ola V'Yored, which is going to be the content, really is the content of all of Parak Bet, and we saw that is where these prakim really kind of touch or are adjacent to the rules of Shevuot. So the way that this chart is, and hopefully it looks pretty clear, but the whether or not the kind of columns, or whether or not I did or didn't have knowledge of my impurity and the sacred space I was walking into at the beginning. And the rows are about whether or not I did or did not have knowledge of it at the end. And so the Ola V'Yored is the top left box, right? That's when I knew that I'd become impure, and then I forgot that I became impure, and then let's say I eat a sacrifice or walk into the temple, and then without without knowing. I'd forgotten, and then I remember again. At the end, I am have to bring a korban olav, right? And then with that, it's fun because it's a chart of 4, but for those of you who looked at the mishnayot, these are actually not the shnaim shein arba that we're going to see in Perek Bet. That's not what it means when it says yidiot too much shnaim shein arba, but it's another shnaim shein arba because this whole masechet is full of them. It's like the Pesach Seder. Everything's just 4 everywhere. But so that's the olav v'yored. If I once knew that I was impure, forgot about it, walk into the temple, don't know, and haven't figured that out yet, then what the Mishnah says is that the shiur lashem, the goat that's brought into the inner sanctum, or whose blood is sprinkled in the inner sanctum on Yom Kippur, that is, it basically it doesn't say that it's mechaper, it's not, it doesn't atone, it is tole until you find out, meaning it sort of suspends what, unclear, but suspends punishment, suspends something, until the point when you find out and you can bring your own sacrifice. And as for all the stuff which you never knew about, let's say I became impure, never having known that I was impure. So based on whether or not I know about it at the end, like whether or not I know about it right now. So based on that, different festival and other kind of sacrifices that are brought during the different times of year cover those kinds of sins. So, and when it's the 3 categories there are on Yom Kippur, the goat that is brought as a sin offering on the festivals, so Pesach, Shevuot, and Sukkot, and the goat that is brought as a sin offering every month on Rosh Chodesh. There's a debate among the Tanaim about exactly what covers what. And I think one of the interesting positions among the Tanaim is Rabbi Meir's position that all of them kind of cover all of those cases more or less together because, it's all sort of the same thing. We bring these sin offering sacrifices as part of the sacrificial process every holiday, whether that's Rosh Chodesh, whether that's a festival, whether that's Yom Kippur, and they all cover these cases where I didn't know anything before and maybe know or don't know about it after. The interesting character who really takes up a lot of space in our chapter is Rabbi Shimon, and he has a very specific regimen he has a very specific way of detailing which sacrifices cover or which holiday sacrifices cover which kinds of sins. So he thinks that at least according to the first way he's brought in the Mishnah, he thinks that everything has its own special kapara. So if I was pure, but I ate ritually impure kodesh, so I ate a ritually impure, let's say like a sacrifice or something, which is also a problem, so that Rosh Chodesh covers. If I never knew that I was impure and don't know about it now, that the festival sin offering covers. And if I didn't know about it at the beginning, but I know about it now, so that Yom Kippur covers. That's the first position, Rabbi Shimon. The details you don't necessarily have to get. The second, another position in the name of Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon in the Mishnah is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. If people know, he's famous for spending a lot of time in a cave. But Rabbi Shimon Ben Yehuda is a different Rabbi Shimon who said in the name of this other Rabbi Shimon, he had a slightly different take on his position, which is that there's a sort of Venn diagram of those same sacrifices, but that Rosh Chodesh, which you bring once a month, only covers the case of eating impure food. The festivals cover a little more than that, including the cases that you never knew about, and Yom Kippur covers more than that. So that's most of the first parak. And then when the end of the first parak tells you, just so you know, everything else, meaning all stuff that doesn't have to do with impurity in the temple, all the other sins, all the kalot and the chamurot, the simple, the not so heavy duty sins and the really heavy duty sins, all of that gets covered by the shiur hamishtalech, the goat that gets sent off the cliff on Yom Kippur. That's more or less Perek Aleph. That was our little run through of Perek Aleph. Perek Bet goes specifically a little bit more of a deep dive into Tumat Mikdash v'Kodashah, right into the and there it starts with really what is the Shtaim Shehin Arba that we were talking about in our first Mishnah. So these are right the two that are for Yidiot HaTumah, the two that are for ways I can know or forget and know about right, about this, the sanctity and ritual impurity. So I can, right, we can talk about two kinds of cases. With a picture here of the steak is about eating kodesh, so eating some kind of sacrificial or sanctified food, and the mikdash, I can walk into the mikdash, and within either of those, I can have forgotten or remembered either the fact that I'm ritually impure, or the fact that the place where I'm walking into or the food that I'm eating is sanctified in some way such that it wouldn't be allowed to eat if I'm ritually pure. So far, so good? Yeah. I'm running through this, then we're gonna get to go into some details. Then as we are discussing the Yediot HaTumah, so there are a couple of details about it. One is just about how the area that can count as the Mikdash for the purposes of the problems of going in and out, and how the constituted, right, how court or Jewish leadership king can add on to the Ir and the Azara, can add on to Yerushalayim, can add on to Mikdash, and a further discussion of what happens if I am inside the temple, and at that point realize that I'm impure, and how the Torah navigates or right, what one must do in a situation which I'm basically caught in the middle of what is already a sin. And then the way that the parak ends is with a I think interesting note, which is that this Shtaim Shehin Arba situation that we thought we saw at the beginning is actually only according to the position of Rabbi Ishmael. Right? Rabbi Ishmael is actually the only one who thinks that all four of these cases are cases in which you would be you would be liable to bring a korban olav yored, as we saw at the beginning, right? That I can remember or forget either the fact that I was ritually impure, or the fact that the place where I was walking was the mikdash / the food that I was eating was kodesh. The two positions among the Tanaim, the positions of Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Eliezer, think that in a situation in which I never forgot my ritual impurity, which is to say, I never forgot that I was tameh, but I forgot, let's say, someone who, and this is actually is probably a case that has happens every so often nowadays, when in a case when someone walks up to the Temple Mount and doesn't necessarily know where he or she is standing, walking into the temple precincts, right, without knowing whether or not I'm standing on holy ground. So that, according to Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Eliezer, it does not make one liable to bring. It's not allowed, but it doesn't make one liable if one does it by accident to bring this specific korban. One only brings this korban in a case in which he or she forgot about their own state of ritual impurity. Make sense? Thus far, that's like the broad nuts and bolts of the two prakim that we saw. It was a bit of a marathon. So just any questions about like basic kind of comprehension questions about the stuff that we just went through, and if not, then we'll kind of start with a deep dive into actually this last Mishnah that we just almost talked about. Anything? Okay. Wait, yeah. Okay, so with all of that, I want us to take a look at this last Mishnah, which describes the opinions of the three different Tanaim, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Ishmael, and describes each of their derivations from the psukim that we looked at a little bit last time, about the korban olav yored, and how each of them derive from those psukim a specific rule with regard to which kinds of yediat hatumah, or which kinds of remembering or which kinds of forgetting render one liable to bring a korban olav yored. And what we just saw was that the Mishnah, as we saw with the Shtaim Shein Arba, that was just Rabbi Ishmael. Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Eliezer definitely don't hold of those last two, where the X's are, those last two cases. But the question is going to be, what do they think? How are they reading the psukim? And I think when we pay when we start paying some close attention to this Mishnah, we'll see that it actually opens up a world of interesting questions that will open up, I think, an even bigger conversation as the parak goes. So would someone be willing to read, you feel free to do it in Hebrew or English, this Mishnah? Let me get a volunteer to read. Yeah, thank you.
רבי אליעזר אומר, השרץ נעלם ממנו, על העלם שרץ חייב, ואינו חייב על העלם מקדש. מקדש. רבי עקיבא אומר, ונעלם ממנו והוא טמא. על העלם טומאה חייב, ואינו חייב על העלם מקדש. רבי ישמעאל אומר, ונעלם שתי פעמים לחייב על העלם טומאה ועל העלם מקדש.
Amazing. So, do you want to read the English too? Were you about to do that?
If you want me to, if you don't.
Yeah, go for it. That'd be great.
Rabbi Eliezer says, or if a person touches creeping animal and it is hidden from him, in a case where one has a lapse of awareness of a creeping animal, he is liable, but he's not liable if he had a lapse of awareness that he is entering the temple. Rabbi Akiva says, the verse states, and it is hidden from him so that he is impure, thereby teaching that in a case when one has a lapse of awareness of ritual impurity, he is liable to bring a sliding scale offering, but one is not liable to bring such an offering in a case when he has a lapse of awareness that he's entering the temple. Rabbi Ishmael says, the verse states, and it's hidden from him, and it states, and it is hidden from him, twice, in order to render one liable in a case where one has a lapse of awareness of ritual impurity, and in a case where one has a lapse of awareness that he's entering the temple.
Amazing. Thank you, Mike. So one thing that I think it's just always, I would just say when learning Mishnah, and at least this is something that I've sort of learned to do, and I think has really helped me pay closer attention to certain things, which is whenever the Mishnah in general, right? When Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi edited the Mishnah, the Mishnah is not a work of Midrash Halacha most of the time, which is to say that the Mishnah doesn't usually explicitly bring verses and explain how the different Tanaim or how the different positions in the Mishnah are reading, like how they're operating hermeneutically, meaning how they're reading the verses in the Torah and interpreting them. It does, though, on occasion, and I think whenever it does, it's always worth looking back at the psukim, trying to understand what's going on there, and trying to think about what might be going on in the Mishnah that makes it that gave Rebbe reason to bring us this midrash explicitly, and I think here is no exception. So it's all three of the rabbis here are darshaning. They're all interpreting the same pasuk. And here, I think this slide might make it look like might bring things out a little bit more easily, right? This pasuk in Vayikra, or these two pasukim in Vayikra that we saw, when the pasuk describes the sins for which a person is liable to bring this korban olav yored, so they describe the different kinds of ritual impurity, and then these three Tanaim are reading the various juxtapositions of the words and trying to and making something out of them. So, right, the pasuk describes, right, a person touches something that's tameh, right, benivlat chaya, okay, and then it says, oh, benivlat, and right where the orange first bolded word is, oh, benivlat sheretz tameh v'ne'elam mimenu v'hu tameh ve'ashem. And then later on in the next pasuk, when it talks about a different kind of tuma, it says v'ne'elam again. So, right, the way that if we go back, Rabbi Eliezer cares about the juxtaposition between hasheretz and v'ne'elam, right? And he says hasheretz v'ne'elam. What does he say? He says what that means is al ha'elim sheretz hu chayav ve'eino chayav al ha'elim mikdash. He's chayav for forgetting the sheretz, but not for forgetting the mikdash. Rabbi Akiva does something similar, right? He sees the more or less juxtaposition between v'ne'elam and tameh. He says al ha'elim tum'ah hu chayav ve'ino chayav al ha'elim mikdash. Whereas Rabbi Yishmael, he doesn't care about the juxtaposition per se, but he cares about the fact that the word v'ne'elam is repeated twice, and he sees that not as right to see that right his hermeneutic here is inclusive, not exclusive. Right, one brings the korban in more cases of he'elim, meaning more different kinds of things I could have forgotten. I could have forgotten the tumah. I also could have forgotten that I'm in the temple, or that I'm eating, or that I'm eating sacred food. So in terms of how each of them read the verse, we get the Rabbi Eliezer caring about the sheretz, Rabbi Akiva caring about the tameh, and Rabbi Yishmael reading the word ne'elam and reading that more inclusively. So I have a question for I have a question, and I'm curious if any of you have instincts about this, right? But if we go back to the Mishnah, the way that it looks right now, if I were to ask you, it's clear that Rabbi Yishmael has a different opinion than Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva. But I'm curious what you would say as to, if I were to ask you, do you think that Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Eliezer agree with each other? Like, do you think that there is a practical difference? Do they have different positions? Or do you think they're just wondering something about the right? Or do you think the only distinction is what word they're picking out? I'm curious if any of you have instincts on this, and if not, I'm happy to go straight to the Gemara. But if any of you have an instinct, I would love to hear it.
Isn't Rabbi Akiva saying liable? Well, the English translation is liable to bring a sliding scale offering.
So it's Rabbi Eliezer says that too. It's
Okay.
English translation. No, that was my fault. It was just like a very long English translation, so I was trying to cut out the unnecessary words that weren't direct translations, and I guess I missed a spot, so my bad.
Okay.
But yeah.
Well,
Yes, Al?
if they agree, then why are they both stated?
Great question. Okay.
There has to be a difference, even if they're using the same words and come to the same conclusion.
Okay, so I think it's a really interesting point, and I think that I think there is really something to it, especially when we think about how Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi arranged this text compared to how we'll see other people arranging the text, or other compendia of Tannaitic literature arranging the text.
Excuse me?
leads yeah.
I think one has to do with in and of himself. Rabbi Akiva, the impurity is on the person, and Rabbi Eliezer, it's outside of the person.
Okay, so you're picking up, right? So you're saying I think both of you, Saul and Debbie, are saying that I want to take seriously the idea that the particular hermeneutics are going to have a difference, right? Saul's saying, and that's because, meaning, like, in terms of why I would think that, like, why else would they bring these as separate positions? And I think what Debbie's saying is, like, okay, so now if we are going to pay attention to the particulars of their drashot, the particular interpretations that they're making from the pasuk, I might think that that tum'ah, right, the Rabbi Akiva is focusing on my state of impurity, whereas Rabbi Eliezer is focusing on the source of my impurity, right? Okay. So that is going to be you guys are on Team Chizkiah in terms of the Amoraic debate about this question, which is that which starts with, when the Bavli sees this Mishnah, the Bavli immediately asks the question of my Beinaihu, right? What is the practical difference, if there is any? Is there a practical difference between the positions of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva? It's concerned with that question as well, and Chizkiah offers one answer. Chizkiah, and we're going to see that this is going to be a debate between Chizkiah and Rabbi Yochanan. Chizkiah and Rabbi Yochanan are two very early Amoraim who are living in Eretz Yisrael, meaning that they're living in not long after the compiling of the Mishnah, and they're living in the same place as where the Mishnah was compiled. Chizkiah is interesting because he's the son of Rabbi Chia, who is thought to be the compiler of the Tosefta, which we're going to see the Tosefta has maybe a different take on this question. But Chizkiah starts by offering an answer. Either Debbie or Saul, given that you guys brought us in this direction, would either of you guys be willing to read? English is totally fine if you want. This Gemara. It's okay if not. You can pass.
I can read the English.
Thank you. Amazing, Debbie.
What is the practical difference between them? Chizkiah says, a case where he did not know whether the impurity was contracted from a creeping animal or from an unslaughtered animal. Rabbi Eliezer holds that we require that he initially know whether he contracted impurity from a creeping animal or he contracted impurity from an unslaughtered animal carcass. And Rabbi Akiva holds that we do not require that he knows this detail since I can't read the end. Since
he knows in general terms that he contracted impurity.
It is not necessary that one know whether he contracted it from a creeping animal or he contracted the impurity from an unslaughtered animal carcass.
Okay. So basically, Debbie, you were absolutely right in terms of what Chizkiah at least thinks, which is right. Chizkiah is saying the practical difference between these two positions, the nafka mina between these two positions, is a case when I didn't know. I knew that I contracted impurity, and I wasn't sure whether it was from either a sheretz or a nevela. So there are some animals that are inherently considered to be inherently impure, and there are some animals that are considered to be impure because they weren't slaughtered properly. Either way, I can contract impurity from them. It's the same kind of impurity. It does the same thing halachically. But the question is, in order for it to count as a full-on ve'elam, meaning a full-on forgetting for the purposes of Yediyot Tuma, do I have to have originally known what kind of impurity I contracted? Right? That's the question that Chizkiah says. That's the difference between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva, on the other hand, like as Devi said, thinks that the idea of forgetting impurity is about forgetting the state that I was in. Right? If I knew that I was ritually impure, it doesn't matter if I knew what the source of that impurity was, but if I knew that I was impure and then I forgot about it, then that counts. And therefore, if I walk into the temple, eat kodesh, whatever it is, I'm going to be liable to bring this korban. So that's the position of Chizkiah, which is that there is a practical distinction between these two, and it's about this. Rabbi Yochanan, on the other hand, and Rabbi Yochanan is actually a student of Chizkiah, so he says not so fast. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, and I'm just going to read it because it's short. Mashmahu dorshin ika benaihu. Rabbi Yochanan thinks, no, there's no practical distinction between the two of them. The difference between them is just limited to the interpretation of the meaning of the verses. Don't make a huge fuss out of it. Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva, they had slightly different ways of reading this, but ultimately, what did both of them want to say? What both of them wanted to say was that you have to bring a korban olav raid if you forgot about your own ritual state of impurity, but not if you forgot about the sacred quality of the thing that you were interacting with, whether the food that you were eating or the place where you were stepping. So, this is the machloket this is the debate as it's brought in the Bavli. And I think often the Bavli really does, I think a lot of the kind of finger waving debates brought in the Gemara actually really do point, especially in the questions that they're asking, actually really do point to ambiguities or gaps that are already present in the Tannaitic literature, right, in the Mishnah. And often when explored further, you can sometimes see that some of the debates that ultimately occur in the Bavli actually have echoes earlier already in the Tannaitic literature itself. And I think this is a really cool example, just kind of a methodological point, a really cool example of a place where we can see that happening when we look at the parallels to our Mishnah as they appear in two other texts, the Sifra and the Tosefta. So for those who are not necessarily familiar with other compendia of Tannaitic literature, so the Tanaim mostly the books that we have that quote Tanaim for the most part are Midrash Halacha. Midrash Halacha is organized according to the Psukim in the Torah, or also there's Midrash Haggadah. But Midrashic texts, I'm talking about halachic literature here. Midrashic texts are organized according to the Psukim in the Torah. Oh, Monica was raising her hand. Sorry, I saw that you were waving, and then I thought that
No.
Yes, ask.
It's
Go for it.
Monique, but
Monique. Sorry.
that's an odd sentence, I think. I'm kind of struggling here to understand.
Mashma'ut dorshini kabeinahu?
Like
Rabbi
there's
Yochanan?
again, mashma'ut dorshin ika beinahu. I mean, isn't it all about interpretation of verses? I mean, the whole thing is how you interpret verses and how you.
So
it's
what is
like it's a dismissal of something that doesn't make much sense, at least not right now to me.
So I do think that, and again, I think sometimes, and the question of why that would be preserved is an additional question. But I do think that sometimes, right, you can get to the same conclusion from a number of different ways, right? And I think this is often true with halachic reasoning in general, right? I have a question of whether something is asur or mutar, and I can come to the same legal answer of, let's say it's mutar based on based on a leniency here and this logic, or based on a leniency here and this logic. Legal reasoning often, right, can get a person to the same conclusion via a number of different pathways. And I think what Rabbi Yochanan is saying is that, sure, there are a number of different pathways, and maybe, and again, the question still arises of why I might focus on one particular diuk in the pasuk rather than another. But at least what Rabbi Yochanan is saying is that there isn't going to be a practical halachic difference between these two positions. They're going to ultimately agree. And the question of focus, right, it might, and then does that mean that the distinction is meaningless? Does it mean that it doesn't matter? I'm not sure. It might mean, but it might mean that the distinction might be more theoretical, abstract. It might come, right, it might come to teach us something that's more maybe theological, but it's not going to have the same kind of practical ramifications. I don't know. Is that satisfying? Does that help? Still not? You prefer Chizkiah? Everyone here prefers Chizkiah. Great. I prefer him too. So,
isn't there another way of looking at that? Because Rabbi Yochanan can't figure out that there's a distinction between them, he has a fallback position that they're talking about interpreting a verse.
You're saying maybe he can't figure it out? So I also wonder, and I think and maybe another way of reading it also, because we'll see it in the Tosefta, is that sometimes, right, the Tanaim said a number of different things, right? That's often true. And the way that these texts are redacted or compiled, right, there are a lot of questions within the kind of academic literature about how intentional or how much the editors or redactors of these texts were agenda driven in particular ways. But I think especially with texts that are that lean towards certain schools, there might be a reason why the redactor of a text would want to make certain positions actually look like they agree with one another. Because if I am a student of the school of Rabbi Akiva, and I think Rabbi Eliezer says something that looks a heck of a lot like what Rabbi Akiva says, but might be a little different, so I might want to edit or redact the text to look like the two positions that maybe there is a difference between them actually are kind of part of the same camp, right? So that, and I think we're going to see that in the Tosefta in a moment. So that's another, again, reason why I might want to say something like Mashma'ut dorshin ika beinahu, that they don't actually disagree, but that really that's what this distinction's about. Yonah.
Me?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I wonder what you think about what Rabbi Eliezer, according to Chizkiah, is thinking. It's such an interesting position that you come in contact with, I guess, some mangled animal, and you're like, I don't know what that was, but it was bad. But there's a threshold that hasn't been met.
So we're going to get to that in a second, because it gets even more extreme when we realize that that position actually like flies in the face of what Rabbi Eliezer thinks in other places about what you have to know. So a later Amorav Eretz Yisrael gets into it. I think it's interesting. Okay, so thus far that's the debate in the Bavli, and so I just want to see how this debate already kind of, we see echoes of it already in earlier rabbinic literature, in which I think we'll see some of what I just said about the kind of wanting to divide people into camps a little bit. So the Sifra, Midrash Halacha on Sefer Vayikra, which means that it's organized according to psukim, and it will bring the positions of the various Tanaim in terms of how they read the psukim. So it's not organized by law or legal category the way that the Mishnah or the Tosefta are. It's organized according to the Torah. So it's on the pasuk, right, that we saw before, V'ne'ela mimenu. I'm sorry that I don't have translation here, but I'll read it and translate. I haven't found a good public domain translation of the Sifra. So V'ne'ela mimenu, the Sifra frames it as a question. The question is V'ne'ela mimenu tum'ah o yachol v'ne'ela mimenu mikdash, meaning, is the ha'elim that we're talking about, is the forgetting that we're talking about, forgetting of tum'ah, or might it be also a forgetting of mikdash? And then as an answer to that question, we see these three different drashot of the different Tanaim. We see Talmud Lomar v'ne'ela mimenu v'hu tameh. That's the drasha that we saw before of Rabbi Akiva. Al ha'elim tumah hu chayav ve'eno chayav al ha'elim mikdash. Divrei Rabbi Akiva. Right, he's chayav for forgetting the tumah but not the mikdash. Then we see Rabbi Eliezer says hasheretz v'ne'ela mimenu. Right, the juxtaposition of hasheretz. Al ha'elim sheretz hu chayav ve'eno chayav al ha'elim mikdash. And then Rabbi Shmuel Omer. Right, we see Rabbi Shmuel says v'ne'elam twice. Shnei pe'amim l'chayev al ha'elim tumah ve'al ha'elim mikdash. So here, right, I just want to point our attention to the fact that these three positions are brought as an answer to basically a yes or no question, right? There's one yes or no question. The question is it just ha'elim tumah, or is it also ha'elim mikdash? Yeah? And these three positions are brought, right, the first two positions are, on some level, are no, and the second position is yes. The first two positions, yeah, they're different ways of getting to the no, but when they're framed this way, right, it all of a sudden looks like they're kind of the same, different ways of getting to the same answer to the question. I think this is just like, we see it even more starkly when we see the Tosefta. The Sifra, again, the question of authorship or redaction of the Sifra is a matter of debate, but there are, I think, there are like strong echoes of that this also is a strongly Rabbi Chia infused text. Rabbi Chia being the compiler of the Tosefta, and we see it even more starkly in the Tosefta. What do we see in the Tosefta?
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Why do you call it a yes or no? Could you?
The question?
Yeah, I see it as, is the focus on the item or on the place? I don't see it as yes or no.
You're saying, I was saying yes or no about the mikdash, but you're saying it's this or this, not
Right.
saying this or both. That's the way
Right.
you're
Right. That the
okay.
Right. What was ne'elam? Is it that
is it this or this? I think, yeah, you're right in terms of the way the question is phrased. The answers are going to be, I think, because the answer, right, I guess Rabbi Shmuel's answer is yes and yes. So maybe it's like this. It's A or B. And then the 1 and 2 are A, not B. And Rabbi Shmuel says A and B. Does that satisfy you? I think you're right. Thank you for the diuk. Thank you for helping me just sort of sharpen it. Maybe not yes or no, but A or B, and then
Right,
But the only options are A and B. It's not like, oh, we have a
Correct.
picture of 3 things. Okay.
correct.
Yeah.
I
Thank
see
you.
that. I just could not see the yes or no, right?
Okay,
Thank
great.
you.
Then the Tosefta, in terms of the way that the picture plays out, here it's even more explicit, right? Here we say, Rabbi Yishmael says, ne'elam, right, shtei pa'amim l'chayiv al ha'elim devar tshuvah ve'al ha'elim mikdash, right? So Rabbi Yishmael, consistent opinion. And then they're really in a camp here. Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva say, and we don't even bring their drashot. They say, eno chayav ela al ha'elim tshuvah bilvad. So the Tosefta, Rabbi Yochanan seems to be interpreting what he is interpreting in the wake of the Tosefta and perhaps also the Sifra. But what emerges then is that given that when we look at the Mishnah, right, all of a sudden the way that the Mishnah is written is the Mishnah sort of like reviving this possibility that actually maybe there are three separate positions here after all, right? The Mishnah just doesn't frame it as an A or B question. It does give us each of their drashot, but it gives them each as like 1, 2, 3 in a row. And the instinctive reading of the Mishnah, when I asked it originally, I think both Saul and Debbie had the instinct of saying, look, no, if these are being presented as 3 different opinions, we should read them as 3 different opinions. And so when I think what makes this get really, really crazy, as Yonah almost brought up, is that what is Rabbi Eliezer really saying, and what are the consequences of Rabbi Eliezer's position? Rabbi Eliezer seems to think that you have to know exactly what it was that made you impure. And what Ula, a later Amura from Eretz Yisrael, is going to ask is actually, this seems to fly in the face of what Rabbi Eliezer thinks about sin, about sin offerings in general, which is that when it comes to a korban chatat, so I bring a korban chatat when I sinned unintentionally, and then at some point I find out that I sinned and I bring a korban chatat. It's different from an olav yored. But in a situation like that, there's a machloket between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua about whether I have to know what it was that I did wrong. So right, the Gemara, the Mishnah in Kretot, I think, brings a case where, let's say I have two non-kosher steaks in front of me. Not only non-kosher, but they're curry. They're like really bad to eat. One is chaylev and one is notar, which are both things which if I eat them, I get curried for. So I have 2 of them in front of me. I think they're both kosher. I mess up. I eat one of them. And then later on, I realized that they were chaylev and notar, and I don't know which one it was. So that's an example. I don't know if it was Shabbat or Yom Kippur. The Gemara also brings a case of sexual intercourse with someone who I think they don't know if it was their wife who was a menstruant or if it was their sister. But either way, a case in which a person is commits a sin and doesn't know what it was. Rabbi Eliezer, I'm not gonna read it inside. Rabbi Eliezer thinks that I have to bring a korban chatat anyway, even if I don't know what precisely it was that I did wrong. Whereas Rabbi Yehoshua thinks that I do have to know precisely what I did wrong. The Mishnah's here; it'll be on the slides after, just for time. And so it seems that Rabbi Eliezer is contradicting himself, right? Here in Kretot, he has what seems to be I'm not sure if it's more lenient or more stringent, but he seems to care less about, do I know what it was that I did wrong? Whereas here in Shevuot, when it comes to the korban olav yored, he needs he wants you to have a very precise understanding of the way in which you're impure originally. And what Ula's answer to this is he also, right, Ula brings a specific drasha from a verse also, right? Asher chata v'hevi amar Rachmana, right? That's when it comes to Kretot. But here, hacha michtiktiv b'chol davar, right? It lists very specifically the different kinds of ways a person could have become tamei. B'chol davar tamei o b'nivlat sheretz, right? It says o b'nivlat sheretz, right? Maybe with a creepy, crawly animal, or other forms of tuma, and it lists them very particularly. So it says, why? Lamali, shma mina, ba'inan adiyah da, ibisharetz itme, even avela itme. So conclude from it that we require that he initially know how he contracted impurity. And that there's something here that, right, there's something particular. What Ula gathers out of, right, this funky Mishnah where Rabbi Eliezer seems to have his own, maybe have his own shita that he might not even have, right? He might not even have his own position. But when we look closely and see that Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, the editor of the Mishnah, actually made it look like he might have his own position, looking closely at that makes us see that actually there's something about the Korban Olav Yoreh that requires a heightened level of, not of forgetfulness actually, but of initial awareness of my state of being, right? Like not only of what it was that happened to me, such that when I forgot, it was I would then be liable to bring a Korban Olav Yoreh. And I think with attention to that, we can look back at the right, that original chart from the first Mishnah, and notice something that's actually interesting about the Korban Olav Yoreh, right? In general, when it comes to a Korban Chatat is not on this list, but right, when it comes to unintentional sin that I have to atone for, have to make up for in some way, we don't require that I knew anything at the beginning, right? I made a mistake. That's the whole point. But when we look at this chart of the different korbanot, what's particular about the Olav Yoreh is that it did require a level of initial awareness. I had to have known at some point that I was impure, and right, so it's not a korban. It's not the same kind of korban for a mistake that other korbanot are, right? When it comes to ritual impurity by mistake in kind of the regular way, which is to say, I didn't know, I got ritually impure by accident, something happened, I walked into the mikdash, and then all of a sudden I find out about it. That, it's not the job of the Olav Yoreh to handle. That happens through this kind of vicarious process through the various sin offerings of the holidays, and not through the Korban Olav Yoreh. But that the Korban Olav, and that's true also of most other sin offerings in general, they're for accidents. But the Korban Olav Yoreh is really being brought when there's a case of serious negligence, which is to say that I was in a state of impurity, and this is true also of Shevuot, right? If I take an oath not to do something, I'm in a state in which I need to be of heightened conscientiousness, of heightened awareness, right? And then on some level, I was negligent with that. I let it slip by me. And an Olav Yoreh is something that I bring in response not to just any mistake, but to some kind of more serious negligence or more serious problem. What's interesting about that, though, is that then we realize that, right, looking at that chart, we see that the Olav Yoreh is not a vicarious, right? It's not vicarious atonement. It's something that, right, it's impurity that was really my fault. And the korban that I bring for it is a way that I have of attending to that, attending to my own negligence. But what happens in these other cases of tum'ah or of impurity, as opposed to other kinds of sin, I do something bad, I bring a korban chatat. It's not exactly vicarious atonement, but this ritual impurity is vicarious atonement, which is to say that there's a communal sacrifice that's brought on the holidays of various types, and there's distinctions among the Tanaim about exactly how that works. But ultimately, I'm sort of not responsible for, right? There's a kind of communal infrastructure that deals with that kind of atonement, whereas the Tumat Mikdash v'Kodashav, for which I was really negligent, for which there was something that I knew of and that I ought to be aware of, that I have to deal with on my own. I want to, okay, due to
So
time,
you have passive
yeah.
involvement in it.
I have passive involvement in it. Say more.
You have passive involvement in the korban.
So yeah, I think that's true. Pat, what do you mean? What do you mean by passive involvement?
Because it's a public korban, as opposed to when you bring a private korban, and
Right.
then you're actively involved. That's what I mean.
Yeah, no, so for sure, I'm definitely, I mean, it's definitely being brought on my behalf. It's not some like magic that's working in the heavens with no, but I still think there is something, and I like that at least instinctively, that is a little bit curious, and I'm is a little bit curious, or at least maybe less doesn't fall as easily on kind of modern ears or modern sensibilities about the notion that there's the vicarious atonement is even possible. And with that, I just want to take a couple of minutes to talk a little bit about the biblical conception of kind of sin and how it looks, and then I think how our Mishnah, maybe how the Mishnah as a text relates to that, and maybe even like limits that a little bit. So yeah, I think you're right that there's something, right? The question of what does it mean to be involved in my own atonement, is when it's happening via some kind of public ceremony, but really is a question. And I think I'm gonna skip a little bit, but I do want to just at least cover the question of really the word kapara. What does it mean, and like what does it signify? Because it's a word that shows up throughout our parak, and I think it's just worth going into a little bit. So right, we see as an example, right, if a case where you didn't know at the beginning or the end, right? We know this word, it's a pretty famous word from Yom Kippur, and the word is commonly translated as atonement, which I think many of us in kind of common parlance use that to mean make up for. But in terms of the actual the etymology of the word atonement, Merriam-Webster will tell you it comes from Middle English, and it means to become reconciled from at one, or in harmony at one. Now, this is a word that I believe was first used as a translation of the word kapara, and it comes out of the Christian tradition, right? The idea of communion and harmony, right? Like the idea of communion, right, shows up, is a kind of Christian theological term. And if you look actually at ancient Semitic languages, and Rashi actually, in I believe the first appearance of the word kapara in the Torah, gives us a very different notion of what kapara is. And I'll see it right from the Vinir Ebbe Einai, which is the fourth line down. Right, he thinks shekol kapara she'etzel avon v'chet ve'etzel panim kulam l'shon kinuach v'ha'avarahim. Right, it is always signifies wiping away or removing. And the idea, right, that Rashi is working with, and I think a lot of the kind of biblical conception of sin, right, is the idea of sin as on some level a stain, right? That an impurity too, right? It creates this kind of stain for which the Beit HaMikdash serves as a sort of magnet. There's some examples here, but right, the example here is that even forget this. There's no actual ritual impurity involved here, but this is an example of a sacrifice to Molech, where the Torah describes it as, right, a sacrifice to Molech, this like foreign god. What does it do? It's tameh et mikadoshi. It defiles my sanctuary, right? That sin serves to defile the holy things, even when it's not a physical defilement of the space. And that kapara, right, this process, this kind of ritual cleansing, ends up wiping that sin away. But one of the things that ends up happening in our parak, and we're gonna is that, right, this kapara process that we saw throughout of these different the different korbanot that are mechaper about the various things, ends up, right, applying to Yediot HaTumah, more or less. But one of the things, I guess the order on these slides is a little weird, but that most of the sins, right, get sort of pinned on the Seir HaMishtalech, the end of our parak, right? We have right, a very intricate set of details of, right, like this, according to the different Tanaim, this goat atones for this sin, these kinds of sins, and this goat atones for this kind of sin, and this, but all of that is about physical defilement of the temple, more or less, right? It's about a person who, in a ritual state of impurity, walks into the temple. Whereas really all of the other sins kind of end up on this one shiur. And I think there are a couple of ways of sort of reading that bifurcation, because I think if you actually look, and we don't have time to go into the original biblical text, but I think if you go into the text of the Torah, and specifically the text of Avodat Yom Kippurim, right, of this temple service on Yom Kippur, it's not so clear that that breakdown is not so sharp. There's clearly, it seems like the kapara, right? It seems like the ritual cleaning out of the sanctuary also does seem to cover other sins as well. Whereas here in the picture that the Mishnah's right, that the picture that the Mishnah is building, the sins, almost all of the sins end up on the shiur HaMishtalech, and the work of Yom Kippur, the work of all of these sin offerings on the different holidays, is about really cleaning house from the physical defilement of the temple. And I think there are a couple of ways that one can look at that in terms of what that means about the various importance of the different components. And one we see sort of in the Tosefta in the name of Rabbi Shimon. I'm not gonna read it inside, but Rabbi Shimon's his take on that bifurcation is that he would say Tumat Mikdash v'Kodashav is more severe than all the transgressions of the Torah. What does that mean? That like this is kind of how it looks, right? What does he say? It says all transgressions of the Torah are like put on this one goat, and then but like the important stuff, they're like the different details. There are 32 different goats that are brought at various times of the year, and like that's there to show you that actually like we have to take physical defilement of the temple deeply, deeply, deeply seriously. So that's Rabbi Shimon's take. But what follows in the Tosefta is this breita here in the Tosefta in the name of Rabbi Shimon is followed immediately by another breita that I think wants to say not so fast, and right, which is it tells the story of an incident in the temple, and I'm gonna read it in English because I think it's a very powerful story. You might recognize it from the Gemara in Yoma. An incident occurred where two priests who were equal, I guess the translation missed something. They were running and ascending a ramp. They were basically trying to racing for the right to perform a certain ritual in the temple. One of them reached the 4 cubits before his colleague, who then, out of anger, took out a knife and stabbed him in the heart. So murder in the temple. Big. Rabbi Tzadok then stood up on the steps of the entrance hall of the sanctuary and said, "Hear this, my brothers, the house of Israel." The verse states, if one found slain in the land, he's quoting the verse about the Eglah Arufah, right? If someone gets killed, and we don't know who did it, right? The entire city is responsible, but he says, right, and you measure to the closest city to see which city is responsible. He says, where do we measure? From the sanctuary or the temple courtyard? Meaning, this isn't murder happening in the middle of a field and God-forsaken who knows where. This is murder happening in the temple. At that point, the entire assembly burst into tears. Then what happens? The father of the boy, the young priest who was stabbed, came and found that he was still convulsing, that his son was still alive. And he said, I'm an atonement for you, that my son is still convulsing and has not yet died. As such, the knife which is in his body has not become ritually impure. So I got good news. We saved the knife. That's what he has to say. In this incident, the Tosefta says comes to teach you that the ritual of purity of the utensils was of more concern to them, and this is right an indicator of kind of the moral depravity of the second temple. Was of more concern to them than the shedding of blood. And similarly, it says about the first temple that Menashe spilled innocent blood very much until he filled Jerusalem from one end to the other. So the Tosefta wants to. We know that we see in the Tosefta here that there's a kind of a warning that maybe we shouldn't understand that picture that way, right? That the way that Rabbi Shimon wanted to. Right? Rabbi Shimon is saying, right, that this whole cleaning house ritual And all the details that they're all about Tumat Mikdash v'Kodeshav is coming to tell us that the Mikdash v'Kodeshav, Tumat Mikdash v'Kodeshav, is more important, or is more severe in some way. The Tosefta is warning us against that. And I think if we look actually at the way that the Mishnah ends, we might see a little echo of that idea as well. And that's the note that I want to end on. Which is that, what do we see, right? We see, again, the end of this first verse, that al shar avirot shebatorah, the kalot v'chamurot, right? This long list of the various kinds of transgressions, all of the stuff that isn't tumat mikdash v'kodeshav, for all of that, the shiur hamishtalech is mechaper, right? All of that is atoned, right? The atonement happens via this shiur hamishtalech. And then we get this kind of interesting note at the end, right? With the final Mishnah, where we see something else that Rabbi Shimon says that actually maybe pushes us in a slightly different direction, right? Which is, it's brought in the context of drawing distinctions between the atonement for the priests and the atonement for the Yisraelim. But he notes something that's particular about the shiur hamishtalech, or not necessarily meaning it's true across the board, but something that we see in the shiur hamishtalech, a word that hasn't shown up as of yet throughout the Mishnah. Right? Rabbi Shimon says, "Kashem shedam haseir na'aseh bifnim mechaper al Yisrael, kach dam hapar mechaper al kohanim." The same way the blood of the goat atones for the Israelites, so the blood of the cow atones for the priests. And then what's happening with this shiur hamishtalech? What is the thing that atones? Not the dam, because we don't sprinkle his blood, but the viduin. The confession. Kashem sheviduyo shel shiur hamishtalech mechaper Yisrael, kach viduyo shel par mechaper al kohanim. Right? That actually what's doing the work when it comes to the shiur hamishtalech, and when it comes to the cow for the other priests, what does the work when it comes to all of these other sins that aren't about tumat mikdash v'kodeshav, is not actually necessarily the cleansing ritual itself, but the confession, right? When the high priest stands there and declares on this goat, we have sinned, and has to explicitly confess the particular sins that the people have done. That really is what ends up cleansing is what ends up doing the work of atonement for these other sins. And I think there's something that can actually be very right. The fact that the cleansing ritual of sprinkling the blood and of these sin offerings, right? There's a way that the framing that we saw in the Mishnah, where tumat mikdash v'kodeshav happens via this kapara ritual, the sprinkling of the blood, right? It's a sort of limiting of the power of this kind of vicarious atonement. The vicarious atonement that we saw, that's not what gets me off the hook for my sins. That's a way of cleaning house for the temple. So the temple was defiled through these, right, through physical impurity that I was or wasn't aware of, mostly in situations, right, and the offerings brought on the festivals and on Rosh Chodesh are for sins that I really was never aware of. Right, the temple can get defiled through impurity, and that needs to be addressed through this process of cleaning house that happens, right, through the sprinkling of the blood. That can happen vicariously because it's not really about me taking responsibility for my own sins. But right, when it comes to sin, right, when it comes to moral or other kinds of or other kinds of wrongdoing, right, let's say if it's something that I knew about and should have taken responsibility for, those kinds of negligent cases that we saw with the Olavio raid, I have to do my own work of bringing a sacrifice. And when it comes to the kinds of things that I don't necessarily bring a sacrifice for, what ultimately atones for them is not the high priest sprinkling blood in the temple, but is this kind of public acknowledgement and confession, right? And this is where what Debbie said about us being right, our passive participation when it comes, right, is even stronger here when it comes to confession. Because on some level, in order for the high priest to confess our sins, right, he has to know what we did, and on some level we have to be active participants in that act of confession. So I think there's a way to look at even the way that this first perek is organized, and the breakdown of Tumat Mikdash v'Kodashav and the process for kapara there, right, which is really about cleaning house on the one hand, as a way of actually encouraging us to look at and take responsibility in a bigger way for the sins for which we do bear responsibility. I'm already over time, so I think I'm gonna call it here. But please feel free to be in touch with any questions that you might have. You have my email, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Next week we'll actually be talking about Shevuot. It'll be awesome.
All right.
so much.
Get ready for oaths.
Looking forward
Take care.
to that. I hope to see you, as many of you as possible, next week. And I want to let people know that the recording of the first class is already up on Drisha's YouTube channel. So if you want to catch up and review, class 1 is already up, and this class today will hopefully be up within a few days.
Could you post how we find it on there? What's it under?
YouTube, the fastest way is to go to youtube.com/strudel Drisha Institute or library.drisha.org to see this and other class recordings. All right.
Thank
And
you.
if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to Drisha or to Shalhevet. And with that, take care, everyone.